He walked out at 2:13 in the morning, and he didn't look back once. That was the part that stayed with her. Not the words, though the words were bad enough, but the fact that Roman Bellavere, a man who had leveled entire city blocks with a phone call, a man whose name made other dangerous men go quiet in rooms, couldn't manage a single backward glance at his wife of 11 years as he crossed the threshold of their penthouse and pulled the door shut behind him with a soft, deliberate click. Vivienne stood in the kitchen in bare feet, holding a mug of chamomile tea she hadn't touched. Clock above the stove read 2:14 by the time she processed that he was gone. His last words were still hanging in the air. From tonight on, you're on your own. She set the mug down on the marble counter and didn't move. Penthouse was 42 floors up. From where she stood, she could see the lights of the city spread out below like a circuit board. That someone had breathed life into all those lit windows, all those people sleeping or arguing or watching television, none of them aware that in this kitchen, in this silence, something had just ended. She didn't cry. That surprised her. She thought she would. She'd imagined this moment, or something like it, a dozen times over the years, in the way you imagine car accidents and diagnoses and other catastrophes you believe you can prepare for. Look, you tell yourself you'll hold it together. You almost never do. But Vivienne stood in the kitchen and felt something closer to cold than grief. Stillness. The way the world goes quiet right before a storm system moves in. She walked to the window. 20 floors below her, the street was empty. Kind of empty, that only exists at 2 in the morning in a neighborhood like this expensive, controlled, kind of block where the garbage trucks came at 6. And the doorman wore ties and everyone minded their own business because everyone had something to mind. She heard the engines before she saw the headlights. The sound built from somewhere north of the building, low and multiple, the kind of sound that doesn't belong on a residential street at any hour. Then the headlights appeared at the far end of the block, not one set, not two, but a column of them, evenly spaced, moving in perfect synchronization like something military. 20 black SUVs rolled into the street below and stopped. They didn't park. They positioned. There was a difference. Vivienne had spent 11 years married to a man who thought about positioning in every context at dinner tables, in meeting rooms, on streets, and she recognized the geometry of what was happening below her window. The vehicles arranged themselves around the building in a pattern that covered every entrance, every exit, every angle of approach. Doors opened. Men stepped out. She stopped counting at 30. They were armed. She could see that even from 42 floors up, and they moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before, taking positions, establishing sight lines, communicating through earpieces. Not police, not Roman's men, whose faces she knew and whose cars she knew. Someone else entirely. Then one man stepped forward from the group and looked up. He looked directly at her window. She didn't know how he could see her. The glass was tinted. The lights in the penthouse were low, but he looked right at her, without hesitation, the way you look at something you've been tracking for a long time. He pressed a finger to his earpiece. A second later, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Unknown number. She answered it. Mrs. Bellavere. The voice was male, middle-aged, with a cadence that suggested he was used to people listening carefully when he spoke. We're here for your protection. I apologize for the hour. Please don't be alarmed. Vivienne looked down at the 30-some armed men arranged around her building. You should know, she said, that don't be alarmed isn't particularly effective when accompanied by a small army. Brief pause. Something that might have been the beginning of a laugh, cut short. Fair point. I'm going to come up, if that's all right with you. There are things you need to understand, and they'll make more sense if I explain them in person. Who are you? Someone who's been watching out for you for a long time, he said. Longer than you know. And Mrs. Bellavere, your husband, just made the biggest mistake of his life. She stood at the window a moment longer, looking down at the street, at the formation of men and vehicles that had appeared from nowhere the moment Roman left. The tea on the counter was cold now. She hadn't drunk any of it. Come up, she said. She hung up the phone and waited. His name was Decker. He didn't offer a last name, and she didn't ask. He was perhaps 60, built like someone who had once been athletic, and had settled into a denser, more deliberate version of that same frame. His suit was dark and unremarkable. He sat in the living room chair that Roman always sat in, which bothered Vivienne more than she expected, and he laid a manila envelope on the coffee table between them without opening it. "I'm going to tell you some things tonight," he said, "that are going to be difficult to hear. Some of them you're going to want to argue with. I'd ask you to hold your questions until I'm done." "I don't usually hold my questions," Vivienne said. She was sitting across from him on the sofa, her feet tucked under her, the mug of cold tea replaced with nothing. She'd offered him coffee. He declined. "I know," Decker said. "That's one of the things we've always liked about you. We, the organization I represent." He read her expression accurately. "Not your husband's organization. A separate one. One that your father built." The room did something strange it didn't change. Nothing moved, but Vivienne felt it alter in some way she couldn't immediately account for. Pressure had shifted. "My father," she said, "has been dead for 19 years. "Yes," Decker said. "He has. But the things he built before he died are still very much alive." He reached over and opened the manila envelope. He slid a photograph across the coffee table. It was old, the color slightly off. The edges of the image, soft in the way of photographs, taken before everything went digital. It showed a man she recognized, her father, Martin Calder, who had died in a car accident when Vivienne was 22, sitting at a table with two other men she didn't recognize, all of them looking at documents spread between them. "What is this?" Vivienne asked. "The beginning," Decker said, "of a lot of things." Martin Calder had told his daughter he was an import and export. She had believed him, the way children believe the explanations their parents offer for complicated things, not entirely, not without some background awareness that the explanation was incomplete, but enough to function, enough to not ask follow-up questions that neither of them wanted her to ask. What Martin Calder had actually been, Decker explained, was the architect of a financial infrastructure that had threaded itself through the legitimate and illegitimate economies of the city for the better part of 2 decades. He hadn't been a criminal in the traditional sense. He hadn't run drugs or weapons or people. What he'd done was more abstract and, in many ways, more dangerous. He'd built the system that allowed other people to run those things without going to prison. Shell companies, layered accounts, cross-border transfers, carefully maintained relationships with a small number of people in positions of legal authority. The kind of structure that looks from the outside like ordinary commerce. He was a genius. Decker said, without particular admiration, the way you'd describe a natural phenomenon. And he was careful. The people who used his network paid him. The people who needed him to keep quiet paid him more. For 15 years, he was the most important man in this city that nobody knew about. And then he died in a car accident, Vivienne said flatly. Decker looked at her. He didn't say anything. "It wasn't an accident," she said. "It wasn't a question. No, it wasn't." She had known this, she realized, or some version of it. She had known it in the way you know things you've chosen not to examine too closely, because you understand that examining them will change everything. Her father's accident had always had a quality to it that didn't quite cohere: the timing, the location, the fact that he'd been alone when he was almost never alone, the details that the police report contained, and the details it conspicuously didn't. "Who?" she asked. "That's the complicated part," Decker said. "The people who had him killed weren't trying to take his network. They were trying to close it down. There's a faction. There's always been a faction that believes what your father built had grown too autonomous, too powerful for any one group to control. They weren't trying to acquire it. They were trying to destroy it." "Did they?" "No," Decker said, "because your father was more careful than they understood. Before he died, before they killed him, he transferred control of the entire network. Every account, every access code, every relationship, every key." He paused. "He transferred it all to you." Vivienne was quiet for a long moment. "I was 22, she said. "I was in my last year of college. I didn't know anything about any of this." "You didn't need to know," Decker said. "Not right away. The network was designed to run without active management. It had safeguards. People like me, whose job was to keep it stable until you were ready to understand what you'd inherited." He looked at her steadily. "Problem is that 15 years later, you married Roman Bellavere." Something shifted in her chest. "What does Roman have to do with this?" "Decker," picked up a second photograph from the envelope, and placed it on the table. This one was more recent, 10 years old, maybe 12. It showed Roman, younger than she'd ever seen him, sitting across a table from an older man she didn't recognize. They were looking at the same kind of documents her father had been examining in the first photograph. Roman Bellavere, Decker said, spent 4 years before he met you trying to locate your father's network, not to use it, to protect it, from the same people who killed your father. Vivienne stared at the photograph. Why would he do that? Because, Decker said, when Roman was 17 years old, your father was the only person who helped his family when they had nothing. Martin Calder put Roman's younger sister through medical school, kept his mother out of debt, did it anonymously, through the kind of structures he was good at building. Roman spent years trying to figure out who his family's benefactor was. By the time he traced it back to your father, Martin was already dead. He paused. Roman has spent the last 15 years making sure the people who killed your father don't get what they were after. Vivienne looked up from the photograph. He married me, she said slowly. Because he married you, because he was in love with you, Decker said. I want to be clear about that. Whatever else is true, that part is true. But he also married you, knowing what you'd inherited, knowing what you were carrying, without knowing you were carrying it, and knowing that every year that passed, the people who wanted to destroy your father's network were getting closer to figuring out why they'd never been able to finish the job. Because it transferred to me, Vivienne said. Because it transferred to you, Decker confirmed. Outside, 42 floors down, she could hear nothing. The SUVs were silent in the street. The men were in position. The city was still making its city sounds, distant and indifferent. But in the penthouse, in this room with its expensive furniture and its family photographs on the side table and the mug of cold tea on the counter, everything had gone absolutely quiet. Where is Roman now? Vivienne asked. We don't know, Decker said. That's what worries us. She didn't sleep. She didn't try. Decker left 2 of his men in the penthouse lobby and went back to the street, and Vivienne spent the hours until dawn, going through the manila envelope piece by piece, sitting cross-legged on the floor of Roman's study, with documents spread around her. In a radius she kept expanding, as she found things that needed to go in new piles. Financial records, photographs, a hand-drawn organizational chart that someone had made in pencil and then partially erased and redrawn 3 times. A thumb drive that she set aside because she didn't have the equipment to look at it yet. And then, at the back of the envelope, a ledger. It was small, the size of a paperback novel, with a dark cover that had the slightly worn quality of something handled many times over many years. She opened it carefully. The entries were in her father's handwriting. She recognized it immediately, that cramped, slightly right-leaning script that had written notes in her school lunches and signed her permission slips and appeared on the birthday card. She still kept in the bottom drawer dresser because she'd never been able to throw it away. The earliest entry was dated 20 years ago, 3 years before her father died. The entries listed payments, not to organizations, not to companies, to a name. Her name, Vivienne Calder, and then later, after the date of her marriage, Vivienne Bellavere. Payments made in her name, routed through account numbers she didn't recognize, in amounts that ranged from the modest to the significant, but the payment dates went back 15 years. Vivienne's hand went still on the page. Payments went back 15 years, 5 years before she met Roman. 3 years before Roman, by his own account, would have started trying to trace her father's network. These were not Roman's payments. They were her father's, structured to continue after his death, routed through the system he'd built, administered by people like Decker, whose job had been to keep everything stable and invisible until she was ready. Her father had been paying for her protection for 15 years, without her knowing she needed it. She sat with that for a long time, the ledger open in her lap, the study around her, full of Roman's things, his books, his files, the photograph on his desk that she'd always assumed was a business contact and now desperately wanted to look at differently. She got up and looked at the photograph on his desk. It was her father, not a business contact, not a professional acquaintance. Martin Calder, 19 years dead, in a photograph that Roman had kept on his desk, for as long as Vivienne could remember, in a plain darker frame. that she had walked past approximately 8,000 times without ever asking about. Picked it up. On the back, in Roman's handwriting, 2 words. I remember. Her throat closed around something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief, and was probably some compound of both that she didn't have language for yet. She stood in the study holding the photograph and listening to the building settle around her, and thought about all the ways a person could love someone, without them knowing the full dimensions of what they were being loved for. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Different unknown number from before. She answered it. Silence on the line for 2 seconds. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Male. Younger than Decker. Tight. With something she identified as controlled urgency. Mrs. Bellavere, don't speak. Just listen. Roman asked me to contact you if something happened to him. Something has happened to him. He's not dead, I want to say that first. But he's not safe, and the people who have him know about the ledger. They're going to come for you next. You have maybe 4 hours before they figure out that Decker's men are outside your building. A pause. There's a key taped to the underside of the second drawer in Roman's desk. Find it. There's a storage unit address on the key's tag. Go there before morning, and don't tell Decker where you're going. Why shouldn't I tell Decker? Vivienne asked, keeping her voice level. Because we don't know yet if Decker is clean, the voice said. And then the line went dead. Vivienne lowered the phone. She looked at Roman's desk. She thought about Decker downstairs, his precise explanations, his careful manner, the way he'd sat in Roman's chair without hesitation. She thought about the ledger in her hands, 15 years of entries in her father's handwriting. She thought about the photograph with its 2 words on the back, crossed to the desk, crouched down, and felt along the underside of the second drawer. The key was exactly where the voice had said it would be. She stood up and held it in her palm. The tag attached to it had an address written on it in Roman's handwriting, and beneath the address 3 more words. Trust your instincts. Vivienne closed her hand around the key. Through the window, 42 floors below, she could see the SUVs still in position, the men still at their posts, Decker somewhere among them, watching the building, watching for threats from outside. Nobody watching for threats from within. She thought about Roman, walking out the door at 2:13 and not looking back, and she thought about what it would mean to make that kind of decision to walk away from the person you'd spent 15 years protecting without explaining why. What kind of calculation that required. What kind of fear. From tonight on, you're on your own, he'd said. But the key in her hand said something different. Vivienne put the ledger in the inside pocket of her coat, pocketed the key, and walked to the closet to find shoes she could move in. She had 4 hours. She intended to use every minute of them. The storage unit facility was in the warehouse district, 20 minutes south of the penthouse by car, longer on foot, and Vivienne didn't take a car because a car meant a driver, and a driver meant a record, and a record meant that whatever 4-hour window the voice on the phone had given her would collapse to something much shorter. She took the service elevator to the basement parking level, found the stairwell that connected to the building's utility corridor, and came out on the adjacent block through a door that was supposed to be locked, but hadn't been, which was either convenient or a trap, and she filed that question away, without resolving it, because she didn't have time to resolve it right now. The night air hit her hard. October in this city meant cold that had teeth, and she hadn't grabbed her heavier coat, just the one with the inside pocket, where the ledger was pressing against her ribs like a hand. She walked quickly, not running. Running drew attention even at 3 in the morning, especially from the kind of people who were awake at 3 in the morning, and she kept her head down and her hands in her pockets and tried to think clearly about what she actually knew versus what she'd been told. What she knew, Roman had left. The SUVs had come. Decker had explained things that sounded true and were supported by documents. A second voice had told her not to trust Decker. Roman's desk had contained a key with an address and a message in his handwriting. What she'd been told, nearly everything else. The problem with being handed a story, Vivienne thought, cutting through an alley that smelled of diesel and standing water, was that you couldn't verify it in the moment. Could only decide how much of it to act on and in which direction. Her father's ledger was real. She knew his handwriting, had known it since she was 6 years old. He was real. The photograph with those 2 words on the back was real. Everything else was narration, and narration had a narrator, and narrators had agendas. She came out on Merchant Street and oriented herself, 8 blocks to the facility. She started moving. Storage facility was called Iron Gate Self-Storage, which was the kind of name that tried too hard to sound secure, and it was open 24 hours, which was the kind of feature that attracted people who needed to access things at hours when questions were less likely to be asked. The woman behind the counter was maybe 25, deep in a paperback novel, and she looked up at Vivienne with the mild, professional incuriosity of someone whose job had cured her of finding anything surprising. Vivienne showed the key. The woman checked a register, typed something, handed Vivienne a laminated unit number card, and went back to her novel without a word exchanged about why a woman in her late 30s was accessing a storage unit at 3:30 in the morning with dried alley mud on the toes of her shoes. Unit 114 was in the second corridor, 3rd door on the left. Fit. The lock turned. She pulled the door up. The unit was not large, maybe 10 by 12, and it was not full. What it contained was a folding table with a laptop on it, a filing cabinet with a padlock that matched a second, smaller key on the same ring as the unit key, a camp lantern on the floor, and a man sitting in a folding chair against the far wall who looked up at her with an expression of profound, exhausted relief. Vivienne stopped in the doorway. The man was perhaps 45, with the kind of face that had been weathered by events rather than years. Dark circles under his eyes deep enough to cast shadows. Button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a stain on the left cuff that she didn't want to examine too closely. "You're Vivienne," he said. "Not a question." "Who are you?" she said. My name is Cass," he said. "I work for Roman. I've been in this unit for 11 hours because I couldn't go anywhere else without getting killed." He said it the way someone says something they've said to themselves too many times already. "I'm the one who called you." She looked at him. She looked around the unit. She looked at the laptop, the filing cabinet, the lantern casting its flat white light across everything. "Where's Roman?" she said. Cass rubbed his face with both hands. "That's the complicated part. Everything tonight has been the complicated part," Vivienne said. "Start talking." What Cass told her took 40 minutes and 2 cups of coffee from a thermos he produced from under the table, and it was not a story that improved with telling. It had the quality of something that had been bad from the beginning and had only gotten more specifically bad as it went on. Roman had known for 3 weeks that someone inside his organization was feeding information to the Moretti faction, the people Decker had gestured toward when he'd talked about the group that wanted to destroy her father's network. 3 weeks of knowing and not acting, because acting meant showing his hand, and showing his hand meant losing the element of surprise that was the only real advantage he had. He started moving pieces, Cass said, quietly, shifting resources, changing communication channels, getting certain people out of certain positions without anyone understanding why. He was building something. He paused, turning the thermos cup in his hands. Problem is someone figured out he was building something before he was done building it. "Who's the leak?" Vivienne asked. Cass looked at her directly. "That's what we don't know. That's what Roman was trying to identify before." He stopped. "Before what?" "Before 2 nights ago," Cass said. "Roman was meeting with someone who claimed to have the identity of the leak, a source inside the Moretti faction who'd been feeding Roman information for months. The meeting was in the financial district. Roman went alone because the source said any additional presence would spook them." He set the thermos cup down carefully on the concrete floor. He hasn't been seen since. Vivienne felt the cold from the unit's floor coming up through her shoes. "You said he wasn't dead." "I said I didn't think he was dead," Cass corrected. "There's a difference. If Moretti had killed him, they'd have made it visible. A message. They'd want his organization to know. The fact that there's been no message means they're keeping him alive for something." He met her eyes. "What they want is access to your father's network. They've always wanted that. Roman was in the way of it for 15 years, and now they have Roman. They'll use him to get to the network," Vivienne said. "They'll try," Cass said, "but Roman doesn't have access to the network. He never did. He protected the external structure of it, kept the right people away from it, maintained the conditions that allowed it to keep running. The actual access, the accounts, the codes, the keys." He looked at her steadily. "Those transferred to you when your father died. Roman knew that. He's known that since before he married you. Vivienne thought about the ledger in her inside pocket. Decker told me the same thing, she said. Something moved across Cass's face. Not alarm exactly, but a sharpening. You spoke to Decker. He came to the penthouse. He had 30 armed men with him. He told you he was there for your protection, Cass said. Yes. And you believed him enough to go with him. I didn't go with him, Vivienne said. I had a conversation with him in my living room, and then I used the service elevator to leave the building without telling him. Cass stared at her for a moment. Then he said, Okay, that's good. That's actually good. But he didn't look fully relieved. He looked like someone doing arithmetic in their head and not liking the numbers. Is Decker clean? Vivienne asked. I don't know, Cass said, and the honesty in it was more unsettling than any specific accusation would have been. He's been in Roman's orbit for 6 years. He was Martin Calder's man, originally one of the people your father set up to manage the network's outer layer. Roman brought him in because he came with Calder's institutional knowledge, which was valuable. 6 years is a long time, and a lot of money changes hands in 6 years, and Decker has access to things that very few other people have access to. He paused. Roman suspected him. He suspected 3 other people too. He was in the process of testing each of them. Testing them how? By giving them different pieces of information and seeing which pieces showed up where they shouldn't, Cass said. Compartmentalized deception. You tell person A that the meeting is at location X, person B that it's at location Y, person C that it's at location Z. Then you wait and see which location gets compromised. Vivienne thought about this, and the meeting where Roman disappeared was the one he gave to Decker? Cass said quietly. Location, time, description of the source. Decker was the only one with the full picture of that specific meeting. The storage unit was very still. The lantern hummed almost inaudibly. Somewhere deeper in the facility, a metal door clattered against its frame in a draft from somewhere. Could be wrong, Vivienne said. There could be another explanation. Yes, Cass said. That's why I'm not sure. That's why I've been sitting in this unit for 11 hours instead of acting. Because if I'm wrong about Decker and I move against him, I lose the one resource we have protecting you. And if I'm right about Decker and I don't move against him, he leads Moretti directly to you. He already knows where I am, Vivienne said. Or he knew. He knows I left the building. How long ago did you leave? She checked her watch. 40 minutes. Cass was on his feet before she finished the sentence, moving to the laptop on the table and opening it with the slightly frantic efficiency of someone whose window of safety had just become calculable and small. The laptop contained files that Cass had been compiling for weeks, and going through them together took another hour that Vivienne felt in her legs and her jaw and the specific exhaustion behind her eyes that came from processing too much information under too much pressure for too long. She sat on the second folding chair that Cass produced from somewhere and looked at account records, communication logs, photographs, and the kind of financial documentation that required a particular kind of literacy to parse correctly. She had that literacy. She hadn't known she had it until now, which told her something about the way certain kinds of understanding live in you without your knowledge absorbed through proximity, through years of overhearing conversations and reading things left on counters and noticing the way certain names made Roman go still in a particular way. The network her father had built was, as Decker had described it, extraordinary. It wasn't a criminal enterprise in the conventional sense. It was infrastructure, the roads and bridges of a shadow economy, and it had operated for 20 years on the principle that the most durable power was invisible power, the power that no one could see well enough to attack. There are 47 active accounts, Cass told her, pointing at a column of numbers. Access to each one requires a biometric key and a rolling numerical code. The biometric was keyed to your father when he built the system. When he died, it should have gone dormant, but it didn't. Because he transferred it, Vivienne said. To you, Cass confirmed. The biometric rekeyed to you, automatically, according to whatever he built into the system. He looked at her, which means you can access all of it. Every account, every record, every piece of leverage that Moretti has been trying to get at for 20 years. I don't know how to access it, Vivienne said. The ledger explains it, Cass said. The last section. I've seen a copy. She had the ledger in her pocket. She hadn't read the last section yet. She pulled it out now and opened it to the back. The final pages were in her father's handwriting, smaller and more compressed than the earlier entries, the kind of writing that suggested it had been written in urgency or in reduced light. Instructions, a sequence, a location, a bank, a specific branch, a specific vault, and a description of what was inside that vault. And at the very bottom of the last page, not instructions, just words. Her father's voice in his handwriting, written to her 20 years ago, knowing she might not find it for years, knowing she might never find it at all. If you're reading this, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person. I'm sorry for all of it. The thing I built was supposed to protect you. I'm afraid that instead it put you in danger. Do what you think is right. You always have. I trusted your instincts before you trusted them yourself. Vivienne looked at those words for a long moment. She thought about the card in her dresser drawer that she'd kept for 19 years. She thought about the photograph on Roman's desk, with its 2 words in Roman's handwriting, mirroring her father's message in her pocket. Trust your instincts. Then she closed the ledger and looked up at Cass. The vault, she said. Is it accessible? During banking hours, Cass said. Yes. If you have the account credentials, which are in the ledger, and if the biometric works, which we won't know until you try. That's 7 or 8 hours from now, Vivienne said. Yes, Cass said. And Decker, if Decker is the problem, will have figured out where you've gone within the next hour or 2. This facility won't take long to identify if you were followed or if your phone is being tracked. Vivienne pulled out her phone and looked at it. She turned it off. She took the SIM card out and put the phone in her coat pocket and the SIM in the filing cabinet and locked it. Cass watched this. Good, he said. We need somewhere else to go, Vivienne said. Somewhere that neither Decker nor Moretti knows about. I might have something, Cass said, but it's not comfortable. I've had a comfortable life for 11 years, Vivienne said, standing up and putting the ledger back in her inside pocket. Tonight doesn't seem like a night for continuing that particular pattern. Cass's somewhere else was a 2-room apartment above a dry cleaning shop that smelled of solvent and steam and had furniture from approximately 1987 and a radiator that made a sound like someone, periodically dropping a wrench on the floor above. It belonged to a cousin of someone Cass trusted, which was a chain of custody that Vivienne noted as imperfect, but accepted as the best available option. They arrived there at 5:20. The sky outside the windows was doing the first gray thing it does before it actually becomes light. Vivienne sat at the kitchen table while Cass made coffee on a stove that required the burner to be lit with a match. She opened the ledger again and read the final pages 3 more times until she understood not just the sequence, but the logic underneath it. Her father had been meticulous. The system he'd built had redundancies built into its redundancies. He had understood, designing it, that the greatest threat to what he was creating was not external assault, but internal betrayals. That in someone on the inside gaining access and using it against the very structure it was meant to protect. So he'd built in what he'd called, in the ledger's terminology, a kill architecture, a mechanism by which the person with biometric access could, if they chose, not just control the network, but collapse it entirely, dissolve it. Make every account, every record, every piece of leverage it contained permanently inaccessible to everyone, including themselves. He built in a way to destroy it, Vivienne said aloud. Cass set a coffee mug in front of her. Yes, Roman knew about that. It was the thing that always worried Moretti most. They want the network, but they can't get the network without you. And if they push too hard, you could make it so nobody gets it, including Roman, Vivienne said. Roman never wanted the network, Cass said, sitting down across from her. He wanted the people who killed your father to not get it. There's a difference. Is there? Vivienne said. Not a question. She was thinking about Roman walking out the door, his final words, the deliberate cold of his voice, saying, from tonight on, you're on your own. And she was putting that, alongside everything she now knew, triangulating. He'd left. He'd let Decker's men come. He'd wanted her to be seen as abandoned, unprotected, suddenly vulnerable. He made himself a target, she said slowly. He left me publicly, loudly, so that whoever was watching would redirect attention from me to him. Cass wrapped both hands around his own mug and looked at the table. That's what I think, he said. Yes. He walked into that meeting knowing it might be a trap, Vivienne said, knowing that if Decker was the leak, the location would be compromised. He went anyway. He went anyway, Cass confirmed quietly, because he needed to know for certain, and because he stopped. Because what? Cass looked up at her. Because he couldn't keep protecting both things at once. He couldn't protect you and protect the secret of what you are. Something had to give. He chose you a beat. He always chooses you. It's never been the problem. Vivienne thought about this. She thought about the weight of being chosen by someone who thought choosing you meant making decisions about your life without consulting you. Who thought love and protection were the same thing. Problem, she said carefully, is that nobody asked me. Cass didn't answer that. There wasn't a good answer for it. The radiator dropped its invisible wrench again. The sky outside the window had gone from gray to the specific pale color that came right before actual dawn. Vivienne drank her coffee and thought about a vault and a biometric and 47 accounts, and a man sitting somewhere in Moretti's custody who had spent 15 years protecting her from something she hadn't known existed. And she thought about her father's words at the bottom of the last page of the ledger, and she thought about what it meant to trust instincts that had never been fully tested. Then the door to the apartment came off its hinges. Not a knock, not a forced entry in the conventional sense. The door simply ceased to exist as a closed thing hit from outside, with enough force that it swung inward and cracked against the wall, and two men came through it fast, already moving toward the table, and Cass was out of his chair before Vivienne fully processed what was happening, his hand going to something at his hip, and the first man hit him hard enough to drive him into the refrigerator, and the second man was at the table, and his hand was around Vivienne's wrist before she'd taken a breath. Don't, the second man said. Just the one word. Vivienne looked at him. She looked at his face, at the earpiece in his right ear, at the jacket he was wearing that was the same dark, unremarkable cut as the jacket Decker had been wearing in her living room 3 hours ago. She looked past him at the door. Decker was standing in the frame. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had been through a version of the night that hadn't been pleasant for him either. And there was something in his expression that she couldn't entirely read, not triumph, not anger, something more complicated than either. I told you, he said, stepping into the apartment, not to go anywhere without telling me. You suggested it, Vivienne said. I didn't agree. Decker looked at Cass, who was upright against the refrigerator, with the other man's forearm across his throat, and blood on his lip from where his face had met the handle. Cass, Decker said, with something that sounded almost like regret. You should have stayed in the unit. You knew about the unit, Cass said. His voice was compressed but steady. I've known about the unit for 3 days, Decker said. I was waiting to see who else knew about it. Vivienne processed this. You followed me to test whether I'd go there. I followed you to see if you were smart enough to leave without me noticing, Decker said, looking at her now. You were, which means you're more ready for this than I thought. He tilted his head slightly. Did Cass tell you about the vault? Among other things, Vivienne said. Did he tell you about Roman's condition? She went still. No. Decker reached into his jacket and produced a phone. He held the screen toward her. It showed a photograph, Roman, sitting in what looked like a concrete room, his wrists zip-tied to a metal chair, a cut above his eye, and the particular pallor of someone who hadn't slept. He was alive, visibly, barely comfortably alive. They sent this an hour ago, Decker said. Their terms are simple. Access to the network by 6 p. Today, or they start making Romans significantly less comfortable. And you're bringing this to me, Vivienne said, because you're the only one who can give them what they want, Decker said. Or the only one who can take away what they want. One or the other. He lowered the phone, and because Roman, before he walked into that meeting, gave me one instruction. He paused. He told me that if it went wrong, I wasn't to try to get him out. He told me to bring everything to you and let you decide. Vivienne looked at the man holding her wrist. She looked at Cass against the refrigerator. She looked at Decker in the doorway with Roman's photograph on his phone, and she thought about all the decisions that had been made about her life by people who thought they were doing it for her benefit, thought about her father's handwriting at the bottom of the ledger's last page. "Let go of my wrist," she said to the man holding it. He looked at Decker. Decker nodded. The man released her. Vivienne stood up from the table and squared her shoulders and looked at Decker with the flat, clear gaze of someone who has just decided something irreversible. "Then tell me everything you haven't told me yet," she said. "All of it. No more managed information. No more pieces given out when you think I'm ready for them. Everything now." Decker looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, not submission exactly, but a recalibration, a recognition. "Sit down," he said. "This part takes a while." "I'll stand," Vivienne said. "Talk." Decker talked for 40 minutes without stopping, and what he said rearranged the furniture of everything. Vivienne understood. He started with her father. Martin Calder had not built the network alone. This was the part that Decker had omitted in the penthouse. The part he had smoothed over with careful language about infrastructure and architecture, and now he laid it out with the flat precision of someone who had decided that incomplete truth had run its course. There had been a partner, not a business partner, in any documented sense. Nothing that appeared in any record, any filing, any of the documents in the manila envelope. A silent architect who had worked alongside Martin Calder from the network's earliest days and whose contributions to its design were, in certain critical respects, more sophisticated than Martin's own. His name was Gideon Voss. Vivienne didn't recognize it. She said so. "You wouldn't," Decker said. That was the point. Martin was the face of it, the one who maintained relationships, who moved through the world visibly enough to conduct business. Voss was the one who built the actual mechanisms, the account structures, the layered authentication, the kill architecture. He paused. The biometric system. Vivienne felt something move through her that wasn't quite cold. "He built the biometric system," she said. "He designed it," Decker said, "which means he understood how it worked. Which means he understood that when Martin died, the biometric would rekey to you." He looked at her steadily, "and which means he spent 20 years waiting for you to access it. Because when I access it," Vivienne said slowly, "he can trace the access point." "More than that," Decker said. "The way the system was built, and this is what Martin didn't fully understand. When he agreed to Voss's design, the biometric rekeying creates its window, a short one, somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, depending on the specific authentication sequence. During that window, the system is simultaneously keyed to the original biometric and the new one. Anyone who knows the architecture and is monitoring the access event can use that window to insert a secondary key." Vivienne stared at him. "He'd be able to get in." "He'd be able to get in," Decker said. "And once he's in, the secondary key supersedes. You'd be locked out. He'd have full control." The apartment was very quiet except for the radiator. Cass was sitting at the table. Now, the man who'd held him against the refrigerator standing near the door with his arms at his sides, and the particular stillness of someone who'd been told to stand down but hadn't been told to relax. The other man was outside in the stairwell. The kitchen smelled of coffee
and dry cleaning solvent
and the slightly metallic quality of a morning that had gone wrong in multiple directions simultaneously. "You were going to let me go to the vault," Vivienne said to Decker. Her voice was careful. "You knew about the vault. You've known about it longer than tonight. You were going to let me walk in there and trigger the window." "No," Decker said. And something in the way he said it, the absence of defensiveness, the simple directness made her wait rather than argue. "I was going to let you go to the vault and use that window to destroy the system from within it, not to give Voss access, to collapse the entire architecture during the rekeying event while it's exposed, while it's vulnerable." He leaned forward slightly. "Your father built the kill architecture, but Voss built a back door. The only way to close that back door permanently is to trigger the kill architecture at the exact moment Voss is trying to use the window. It takes both events happening simultaneously to make the collapse permanent. Otherwise, the system regenerates. You need Voss to be actively attempting access, Vivienne said, at the exact moment I destroy it. Yes. Which means you need him to know I'm going to the vault. Which means, Decker said, I need you to walk in there, knowing he'll be watching. Vivienne looked at him for a long time. She thought about everything he'd told her in her living room. The carefully sequenced revelations, the documents presented in the right order to build a particular picture. She thought about the way trust was constructed, not given, but manufactured, piece by piece, each piece contingent on the last. "Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning?" she said. "Because from the beginning you had no reason to trust me," Decker said. "And the only way to ask someone to walk into a situation like this is to give them enough truth first that the ask doesn't sound insane when it finally comes." "Still sounds fairly insane," Vivienne said. "Yes," Decker said. "It does." She turned away from him and looked at the window. The sky was fully light now, the gray replaced by the pale, washed-out blue of an October morning, and the street below was beginning to have people in it. Someone walking a dog, someone in work clothes moving toward a bus stop, the city assembling itself back into its daytime shape without any awareness that up here, above a dry cleaning shop, the shape of several lives was being negotiated. "Where is Voss now?" she asked. "We believe he's in the city," Decker said. "He's been in the city for 3 weeks." "That's not a coincidence. That's when Roman started to notice the internal leak, which means that's when Voss activated whatever arrangement he has inside Roman's organization." Vivienne turned back. "Voss is connected to Moretti. Voss has been using Moretti," Decker said. "There's a difference. Moretti wants the network for conventional reasons, financial leverage, information control. Voss wants the network because he built half of it and considers it his. Moretti is the muscle. Voss is the reason." "And Roman?" Vivienne asked. "Does Roman know about Voss?" Decker's expression shifted. "Not much. Enough Roman knows Voss exists. He's known for 2 years. He didn't tell you because..." He stopped. "Because he was protecting me," Vivienne said, and the words came out with an edge she hadn't entirely planned. "Because he didn't know how much of what Voss claims is true," Decker said carefully. "Voss has made certain assertions about your father's intentions, about why the network was built, about what Martin Calder was actually doing in the final years before he died. Roman wasn't certain how much of it was true, and he didn't want to hand you a version of your father that might be." He paused again. "Say it," Vivienne said. "Complicated," Decker said. Vivienne laughed. It came out short and not particularly warm. "More complicated than tonight already is?" "Yes," Decker said. "Actually, yes." What Decker told her next, in the kitchen of that apartment above the dry cleaning shop, with the October light coming through the window and the radiator making its periodic complaint, was the thing that changed the weight of the night permanently. Martin Calder, in the last 18 months of his life, had been in contact with the faction that eventually had him killed, not as a collaborator, not as far as Decker could verify, as a willing participant in anything. The contact had existed, and it had been about the network, and the nature of the conversations reconstructed from fragments in Voss's possession and corroborated by a single document that Decker produced from his jacket pocket and laid on the table, suggested that Martin had been considering something that he had never discussed with anyone else. He had been considering shutting it down himself. Vivienne picked up the document. It was a single page, a photocopy of something handwritten, and the handwriting was her father's. She recognized it instantly. The date at the top was 8 months before he died. The letter was addressed to no one, no salutation, no name. It read like something written to clarify thoughts rather than to communicate them. It described the network as it had evolved over 15 years and assessed what it had become with a clarity that was painful to read because the clarity was not proud. Her father had been building something. Somewhere in those 15 years, he had looked at what he was building and understood that it had grown into a shape he hadn't intended and couldn't entirely control. "I built a cage," he had written, near the end of the page. "I told myself it was a house. Now I can't tell the difference, and I'm not certain anyone inside it can either. If I had built it differently, or not at all, the question would be academic. I didn't, so it isn't." Vivienne read those lines twice. She set the document down. "He was going to destroy it," she said, "or they killed him." "We think so," Decker said. "Voss thinks so." Which is why Voss moved against him when he did. Voss didn't want the network destroyed. He wanted it for himself. Your father dying was the only way to stop the shutdown and create the window however long. The window took for Voss to find a way in. "Voss had my father killed," Vivienne said. The room was very quiet. That's what the evidence suggests, Decker said. Not Moretti, not some unnamed faction. Gideon Voss, her father's partner, the man who had built half the system, who had designed the biometric rekeying, who had understood exactly what Martin's death would set in motion and had decided that what it would set in motion was preferable to watching Martin dismantle 20 years of work. Vivienne sat down. She didn't decide to. Her legs made the decision for her, and she was in the chair before she'd processed the intention to be there. And she sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the middle distance and felt the particular quality of rage that was too large for the room that contained it. Cass, across the table, didn't say anything. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you know that whatever you'll say is going to be the wrong thing, and silence is the only option that doesn't make it worse. Decker waited. Roman knew, Vivienne said finally. Her voice was even. She was working to keep it even. Roman suspected, Decker said. For 2 years, he was building a case. He wanted to be certain before he brought it to you because he didn't want to give me a complicated version of my father, Vivienne said. She looked up at Decker. He decided that for me. He decided I couldn't handle it. I think he decided he wanted to give you certainty instead of suspicion, Decker said. I don't think that's the same thing. It feels like the same thing from here, Vivienne said. Picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway, the cold and the bitterness of it useful somehow. Something solid and immediate in a morning that had become increasingly abstract. Okay, she said. She set the mug down. Tell me how the vault works. They left the apartment at 8:20, and by 9:15, Vivienne was standing outside the Meridian Private Bank on Holloway Street in a coat she'd borrowed from a woman in Decker's support team who was approximately her size, her own coat with the ledger in its pocket, handed off to Cass, who was 4 blocks away in a parked sedan, watching 3 different screens simultaneously. Plan was simple in the way that plans built on 10 interdependent variables are simple. The simplicity was a construction, a way of making the thing feel manageable enough to attempt. Vivienne would enter the bank. She would access the vault using the credentials in the ledger and her biometric, which the system would recognize even after 20 years, because Voss had built it to. She would begin the kill architecture sequence. And at the exact moment, Voss attempted to exploit the rekeying window, which Decker's technical people would detect through monitoring equipment already positioned near the bank's server infrastructure. She would complete the sequence and collapse the system permanently. The part of the plan that was not simple was that Vivienne would be in the vault alone. While this happened, because the biometric authentication was individual and non-transferable, and because any additional presence in the vault would be registered by the bank's security as an unauthorized entry and trigger a lockdown that would compromise the timing. You'll be in contact the entire time, Decker had told her. Earpiece. We'll be monitoring from outside. The moment Voss makes his move, I'll tell you. And if Voss doesn't make his move, Vivienne had asked. He will, Decker had said. He's waited 20 years for this access point. He won't let it pass. And Roman? She'd asked. Decker had looked at her with something careful in his expression. Our people are working on Roman's location. The photograph they sent came with metadata that Cass's team has been analyzing since I received it. We have a probable location. We have people moving toward it. Probable, Vivienne had said. Best available, Decker had said. I'm sorry. It's the best available. She had thought about the photograph on her phone. Roman in the concrete room, the cut above his eye, his wrists zip-tied to the chair. And she had put it in the part of her mind where she was keeping all the things she couldn't act on directly right now, the part that was filling up uncomfortably fast. Now she stood on Holloway Street in the borrowed coat and looked at the bank's glass facade and thought about her father writing. I built a cage in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere, and she went in. The vault access process took 11 minutes. The bank manager, a composed woman named Ellard, who had clearly been briefed on the account's nature to a degree that suggested either unusual discretion or unusual compensation, guided Vivienne through 3 layers of authentication without commentary or visible curiosity, which Vivienne appreciated in the abstract way you appreciate things that aren't adding to your problems. The vault itself was not dramatic. Vivienne had expected drama, had perhaps half-consciously expected something cinematic, commensurate with the weight of what was stored here. What she got was a room roughly the size of a large walk-in closet, with a terminal on a steel table and a series of locked boxes on one wall, and lighting that was fluorescent and slightly buzzy, in the way of lighting that has been doing its job for too long. The terminal prompted for the numerical sequence from the ledger. She entered it. The terminal prompted for biometric palm print. The instruction said, and she put her right hand on the reader, with a flatness of emotion that surprised her, as though the moment had become too large to feel in real time and would have to be processed as later from a distance. Terminal went through something that looked like loading. Progress indicator. A small green light. Then a sound, a soft confirmatory tone, and the screen changed to show a dashboard. 47 accounts. Total values she didn't look at directly. An interface for the kill architecture sequence in the lower right corner of the screen, in the center of the screen, locked behind a second authentication that required a 12-digit code she'd memorized from the ledger's final page. In her left ear, Decker's voice. "You're in, I'm in," she said quietly. "Don't initiate the sequence yet. We need Voss to detect the access and begin his attempt. Give it 2 minutes. Stay on the line." She stood in the vault with her hands at her sides and waited. The fluorescent light buzzed. Phosphorescence lowered. Somewhere behind the wall she could hear the faint mechanical sounds of the bank's climate control doing its work. She thought about her father standing in a room like this, or one like it, 20 years ago. She thought about him writing that letter to no one, trying to find language for the thing he'd built and what it had become. Vivienne. Decker's voice in her ear changed register. "We have a problem." She kept her eyes on the screen. "What kind?" "Voss isn't approaching the network," Decker said. "He's not attempting access. Our monitoring equipment is showing nothing on the server side." A pause. A short one, but the kind that contained something being decided. "He's not here for the network right now, then. Where is he?" A longer pause. "Our people just reached the location from Roman's photograph metadata." Another pause. "Vivienne, Roman wasn't there." The fluorescent light buzzed. Her hand was on the edge of the steel table, and she was gripping it without having decided to grip it. "The location was empty," Decker said. "Clean. Swept. They were never there, or they moved. And the metadata," he stopped. "Say it," Vivienne said. "The metadata was manufactured," Decker said. "The photograph is real. Roman is real. The situation is real. But the location embedded in the file is false. We were sent in the wrong direction." He paused once more, and she could hear in his voice the specific quality of someone who has just understood something and is deciding how fast to say it. "Vivienne, the photograph was sent to us 4 hours ago. They wanted us chasing a false location. They needed us to receive it 4 hours ago, which means they knew you were coming to the bank this morning. Which means," Vivienne said, very slowly, "this is the trap." "Not for the network," Decker said, and his voice was tight now, in a way it hadn't been all night. "Vivienne, get out of the vault. Get out now." She turned toward the vault door, closing. Not slowly the measured, hydraulic closing of a bank vault on its normal mechanism, but faster, with purpose, as though someone had initiated the close sequence remotely. She crossed the vault in 4 steps and got her hand into the gap, and the door stopped, held by the magnetic resistance of her palm pressed against the seal, and she pushed back against it with her full weight, and the door held but didn't reverse. She understood in the same moment that she was not going to be able to hold it open with her body alone. The people who had sent the false metadata and manufactured the 4-hour window and directed Decker's team to an empty location had known she would be in this vault at this time and had arranged for her to stay in it. "Decker," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that in some distant way. "The vault door is closing remotely. I can't stop it." The sound that came back through the earpiece was not Decker's voice. It was a different voice entirely. Male, older, with an accent she couldn't immediately place and a quality of precision that suggested someone who chose words the way engineers chose load-bearing materials. "Mrs. Bellavere," the voice said, "I've been looking forward to speaking with you for a very long time." The door sealed with a sound like finality itself. Terminal screen had changed. The dashboard was gone. In its place, a single line of text, and below it a camera icon that told her whoever was speaking could see her. The line of text read, Hello, Vivienne. I knew your father. Voss, she said. Yes, the voice said. I want you to understand something before we discuss terms. I didn't come here for the network. I came here for you. The network is, how do I put this? The network is a tool. Tools matter only as much as the hands that hold them. A pause. Your father understood that eventually. It's why he wanted to shut it down. Grown sentimental. It's an occupational hazard of people who love their children more than their work. He built it to protect me, Vivienne said. He built it because he was brilliant and ambitious and couldn't stop building things, Voss said pleasantly. Protection narrative came later. People are very good at reframing their desires as their virtues. A brief silence. You've been in this vault for 14 minutes. You have access to the kill architecture sequence. I'm going to suggest that you don't use it. Why would I take your suggestions? Because Roman Bellavere is with me, Voss said. And the kill architecture sequence, as your father designed it, takes 7 minutes to complete once initiated. I will know the moment you initiate it, and 7 minutes is a long time. Vivienne stood in the sealed vault with the fluorescent light buzzing, and the terminal screen showing Voss's text, and looked at the camera icon and thought about 7 minutes and what could happen in them. Thought about the ledger. She thought about the last page. She thought about the sequence she had memorized, 12 digits. In order, no deviation. She thought about Roman in a concrete room with his wrists zip-tied to a chair. And she thought about the cut above his eye in the photograph. And she thought about Decker's voice saying he always chooses you in the kitchen above the dry cleaning shop. She thought about her father's words. You always have. I trusted your instincts before you trust them yourself. I want to speak to Roman, she said. In time, Voss said. Now, Vivienne said. Before I make any decisions. That's not a negotiation. That's a condition. A silence. Longer than the previous ones. The kind of silence that wasn't absence but calculation. Then a new sound on the line. Breathing. And then Roman's voice roughened, compressed with the specific texture of someone who was in pain and was refusing to let it show completely. Viv, he said. Just the one word. Are you hurt? She said. I've been better, he said. Don't. The line shifted back to Voss. As you can hear, he's functional. Whether he remains that way depends entirely on what you do in the next few minutes. Vivienne looked at the terminal screen. She looked at the kill architecture interface in the lower right corner that was no longer visible. The dashboard was gone, replaced by Voss's text, but whose 12-digit entry code was still in her memory, clear and exact. She looked at the camera icon. She put her right hand in her coat pocket and closed it around the thing that was in there, not the ledger, which was with Cass 4 blocks away, but something else. Something she'd taken from the second folding chair in the storage unit when Cass wasn't watching, because she had a habit, developed over 11 years in Roman's world, of taking things that might be useful without announcing that she was doing so. A secondary drive, small, the size of a thumb, with a port that matched the terminal's input socket. Cass had said the laptop in the unit connected to a monitoring system. The drive had been beside it, unlabeled, in a way that suggested it was part of the same setup. She hadn't known then what it was for. She had an idea now. Kept her hand in her pocket and her face toward the camera, and she said, All right, Mr. Voss, let's discuss terms. Because she needed him talking. She needed him present and engaged and believing he was in control. And she needed 45 seconds in which the camera was watching her face, while her right hand did something he couldn't see. And she needed whatever was on this drive to be what she thought it was. And she needed the terminal to accept it. And she needed none of the next 45 seconds to go wrong in any of the 7 specific ways they could go wrong. She needed all of that. And she had nothing left to lose by trying. The drive went into the port with a click so small. She felt it more than heard it, and she kept her eyes on the camera icon and her expression that communicated consideration, a woman communicating or something, thinking through her options, weighing terms, performing the particular calculus of someone who believed they were negotiating from weakness. Voss was still talking. He had the quality of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in his head many times over many years, and now that it was finally happening, he was in no hurry to reach the end of it. He talked about her father with the proprietary familiarity of someone describing a professional partnership that had been, in his telling, more equal than Martin Calder had ever acknowledged. He talked about the network the way a parent talks about a child that has been wrongly taken from them. He talked about 20 years of waiting with the patience of someone who had made peace with a very long timeline. Vivienne let him talk. She needed 45 seconds, and he was giving her far more than that, and she used every second of the excess to do what she was doing, slowly enough to be invisible to a camera watching her face. The drive's port connection had established. The terminal which Voss had commandeered to display his text interface had registered the secondary input without flagging it, either because the drive was compatible with the system in a way that bypassed the alert protocols, or because Voss's remote access was focused on the display layer and not on the hardware inputs, and either way the result was the same. A small indicator on the terminal's status bar, half hidden behind Voss's text interface, showed the drive was active. She didn't know what was on the drive. She had a hypothesis based on context, Cass's monitoring setup, the laptop, the kind of equipment you assembled when you were tracking a network server activity from outside its perimeter. But a hypothesis was not knowledge, and what she was about to do was commit to an action whose outcome she could not fully predict, which was, she was discovering the condition of all the decisions tonight. "Mr. Voss," she said, interrupting him mid-sentence, "I want to ask you something." A brief pause. The interruption had mildly surprised him. "Ask the biometric system," she said. "You designed it to rekey when my father died. You designed the window that appears during the rekeying event. You told me yourself you came here for me, not the network. The network is a tool." She kept her voice level, and curious, the voice of someone trying to understand rather than challenge. "So what do you actually want?" The silence that followed was not the silence of someone calculating their answer. It was the silence of someone surprised by the precision of the question. "Your cooperation," Voss said finally. "Your father's network, under your control and your authorization, operated according to a new set of terms. Terms that don't require anyone to hide. Terms that acknowledge what this infrastructure actually is, the most sophisticated financial architecture in the private sector, operating without oversight, because oversight has never been able to catch up with it." His voice had changed slightly, acquired a quality she could only describe as genuine. "Your father wanted to destroy it because he was afraid of what it had become. I want to keep it because I understand what it could be." "And Roman," Vivienne said. "Collateral," Voss said. "I have no particular interest in Roman Bellavere. He's been a useful obstacle in the sense that overcoming useful obstacles clarifies what you actually want. I don't need him." "Then release him," Vivienne said, "as a demonstration of good faith. Release him, and I'll listen to your terms." Another silence. This one was the calculating kind. In her coat pocket, her fingers found the second thing she needed from the storage unit, not just the drive, but a folded piece of paper that Cass had printed and left beside the laptop. Page of technical notes about the monitoring system's remote interface capability, which she had read once in 30 seconds and retained because she had the kind of memory that retained things it had read under pressure, which was one of the facts about herself that Roman had known, and she had somehow never fully credited. Terminal status bar showed the drive fully loaded. Press the single button on the drive's exposed end with her thumbnail. "Good faith," Voss said, and she could hear in the word the beginning of a decision. "All right, I'll have Roman." The terminal screen went white, not blank white, a specific white of a system processing something at a level that overrides its display function. And then the Voss text interface, fragmented, broke into columns and disappeared, and the original dashboard reappeared, 47 accounts. The full interface, the kill architecture sequence in the lower right corner, and in Vivienne's ear she heard Decker's voice come back. Sharp and immediate. "Vivienne, we're back. What did you do?" "I'm not entirely sure," she said, which was honest. "Cass's drive, I inserted it into the terminal." A beat. Then Cass's voice, from somewhere near Decker, loud enough to carry through the earpiece. "She used the network isolator." "Oh, she used the network isolator." That's a sound that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. That breaks the remote access. It severs Voss's control of the terminal and reinstates local access only. Can't see her anymore. He can't hear her. "Is the vault door still sealed?" Vivienne asked. Pause while someone checked something. Yes, Decker said. He doesn't have the terminal anymore, but he still has the physical lock. We need to get to the bank's security panel to override the door mechanism from outside. That's going to take a brief consultation she could hear but not parse. 8 minutes. Maybe 10. I have Roman's location, Vivienne said. It came out more certainly than she'd intended. We lost the metadata trace, Decker said. Not the metadata, Vivienne said. When Voss put Roman on the line, Roman said 2 words and then Voss cut him off. He said don't, and then the line switched back. Roman was going to say don't do something. Don't initiate the sequence. Don't comply. Don't, she stopped. She turned the word over in her mind, the texture of Roman's voice, the 2 syllables and what they'd contained. He said don't, and his voice had a specific quality, the way it sounds when he's trying to communicate 2 things at once. When there's a surface message and something underneath it. Vivienne Decker began. He wasn't telling me not to act, she said. He was telling me the location. Don't, Donner. She thought about it hard, pressing her memory for the exact sound. Donner Freight, the warehouse on the South Pier. It's a Bellavere property. Roman keeps 3 of his distribution operations running out of it. It's the kind of place that looks like exactly what it is, which is why nobody looks too carefully. She was certain as she said it, the certainty coming not from logic, but from 11 years of knowing a person's voice, well enough to hear what it wasn't saying. That's where he is. Silence on the line. Then Decker said, get to the terminal. Start the sequence. You'll have 7 minutes before the collapse completes, and I need the system down before Voss regroups and finds another way in. Can you do that? Vivienne was already at the terminal. Yes, she said. She entered the 12-digit code from memory. Sequence initiating now. The screen changed. A progress indicator appeared. 7 minutes, counting down. She stood in the sealed vault with the fluorescent light buzzing above her head and watched the numbers fall and thought about Roman in a warehouse on the South Pier and thought about Voss somewhere in the city losing his terminal access and understanding what was happening, and she thought about what a man like that did when the thing he'd waited 20 years for began to disappear in real time. She thought he would not take it quietly. She thought 6 minutes and 40 seconds was a very long time to wait in a sealed room. The vault door opened at 6 minutes 12 seconds remaining, which meant the bank's security over Ide had taken less than 8 minutes. And Decker's team was faster than their estimate, or more motivated by the countdown than by their estimate. And Vivienne came out of the vault into the bank's secure corridor, with the terminal behind her still running its sequence and the progress indicator now at 6 minutes 4 seconds and falling. Ellard, the bank manager, was in the corridor with 2 of Decker's men and the expression of someone who had agreed to a level of unusual activity that had since exceeded even generous interpretations of that agreement. The system needs to complete its sequence undisturbed. For 6 more minutes, Vivienne told her. No one enters that vault. No one touches the terminal. Mrs. Bellavere, Ellard began. 6 minutes, Vivienne said, already moving toward the corridor exit. Then it's over, and you can have your bank back. She came out onto Holloway Street into the October morning, and Decker was there with a car idling at the curb, and she got in and said Donner Freight, South Pier, before the door was fully closed, and Decker looked at her for 1 second from the front seat with an expression that she couldn't read. And he said something to the driver, and the car moved. How many people do you have? Vivienne asked. At the pier, in the next 3 minutes. 6. He was on the phone as he said it, and the conversation happening in parallel was rapid and technical. I've called for more, but they're 15 minutes out. 6 against Voss's people, Vivienne said. Voss operates with a small team, Decker said, hand over the phone. He's not Moretti. He doesn't work with armies. He works with Precision 3-4 people who know exactly what they're doing. The advantage is we know where he is before he knows we're coming. He knows the network sequence initiated, Vivienne said. He knows he lost terminal access. He knows the network is collapsing. Yes. So he knows his leverage is gone, she said, which means Roman is no longer useful to him as leverage. Decker looked at her. He didn't say anything. Drive faster, Vivienne said to the driver. Donner Freight occupied the end of the South Pier in the way that working warehouses occupy their space functionally, without aesthetic consideration, built for volume and access, rather than anything a person would choose to look at. 3 connected structures, loading docks on the water side, a vehicle yard on the street side, the whole complex running on a skeleton crew this early on an October morning, with the light coming off the water flat and cold. The car stopped at the yard's perimeter, and Vivienne was out before Decker finished speaking, moving toward the main structure with her coat pulled tight and her eyes doing the kind of rapid inventory she hadn't known she was capable of until tonight had required it of her. 3 vehicles in the yard that didn't belong to freight operations, too clean, too uniform. Kind of vehicles that were carrying people rather than cargo. Decker's hand caught her arm. "You don't go in first. You have 6 people," she said, without stopping. "You need the layout." "I know the layout." He released her arm. She heard him swearing quietly behind her and didn't slow down. The main structure's side door was unlocked. She pushed through it into the smell of diesel and metal and cold concrete, and the particular acoustics of large indoor spaces. Her footsteps multiplied and returned to her from 3 directions. The freight floor was 80 meters of stacked pallets and loading equipment lit by high overhead fixtures that left the edges of the space in a dimness that wasn't quite darkness. She moved along the wall, Decker 2 steps behind her with one of his men, the other positioned at the exterior exits, per the rapid arrangement she'd half heard in the car. The sounds came from the structure's interior office, block voices, not shouting but emphatic, and under them the sound of something she identified, after a half second, as a chair being dragged across concrete. She went through the office block door and down a short corridor and through a second door and into a room that was approximately what she'd imagined from the photograph: concrete walls, overhead fluorescents, specific quality of a space that was used for storage and occasionally other purposes that its operators preferred to keep in rooms without windows. Roman was there, wrists still zip-tied, but to a different chair than the photograph, the Donner chair, a plain metal folding thing, and there was more blood than the photograph had shown. Cut on his forehead that had run and dried, another on his jaw that was more recent. He was upright. His eyes found her the moment she came through the door, and what crossed his face was not relief, first, but something harder, something that looked like, "Why are you here?" And of course you're here, occupying the same expressions, simultaneously. 2 men in the room with him, both on their feet, both with weapons that came up when Vivienne came through the door. Decker and his man came in behind her, weapons already drawn, and the room had the specific geometry of a standoff, nobody in a good position, everyone in a position that ended badly, if anyone made the first move. "Vivienne," Roman said. His voice was rough but controlled. "You were supposed to stay at the bank." "The vault's sealed," she said. She didn't look away from the 2 men. "I had some time to think." "How much time?" "About 6 minutes." Something moved across his face. "Did you?" "Yes," she said. "It's done." One of the 2 men, the one closer to Roman, said something in a language she didn't catch to the other man, and the second man moved fractionally, a micro-adjustment in his stance, and Decker said "don't" in a voice that was absolutely flat, the voice of someone who had made a decision well in advance of the moment requiring it, and the micro-adjustment stopped. "Voss," Vivienne said. She was still in the doorway. "Where is he?" Neither man answered. "He's not here," Roman said. "He left 20 minutes ago, when he realized the terminal access was breaking down. He has a secondary location, I don't know where." Vivienne looked at the 2 men. "You're going to put those down," she said, indicating their weapons. "And then you're going to sit down. And then someone is going to tell me how to reach Voss." "Lady," the closer man said, "you don't understand who you're talking to." "I understand exactly who I'm talking to," Vivienne said. "You work for a man who just lost the one thing he's been building toward for 20 years. In the next 30 minutes, the financial network that he spent 2 decades trying to acquire will have finished collapsing. After that, he has no leverage, no resource base, and no architecture to work with. Whatever he's offered you is now unsecured." She let that sit for a second. "Whereas I have 47 accounts worth of institutional knowledge about how money moves in this city, and I know which of those accounts have been funding operations that certain people would pay significantly to keep unexamined." She looked at both men in turn. "So I'm asking one more time, and then I stop asking and start making calls. The second man, the one farther from Roman, looked at the first. Conversation happened in the look. The kind of conversation that was really a calculation. And the calculation was not a difficult one. He put his weapon on the floor. After a moment, the first man did the same. Decker's people came in from the exterior, and reorganized itself, and the room reorganized itself rapidly, and Roman was on his feet with the zip ties cut, and Vivienne was 3 steps away from him, and they stood looking at each other across those 3 steps, with the weight of the night between them and around them and under everything. "Your hands," she said. His wrists were raw from the zip ties and bruised at the joints. "Fine," he said. His voice had the compressed quality of someone managing pain he wasn't going to discuss. "They're not fine," she said. "Don't do that." He looked at her. Something in him went slightly less rigid. "Okay," he said. "They're not fine." She crossed the 3 steps and took his hands carefully, turning them so she could see the damage, and she held them and didn't say anything. And he looked at the top of her head while she looked at his wrists, and the room continued to do the things rooms do when situation conclude, and people begin the process of managing aftermath. "You walked out," she said. She wasn't looking up at his face. She was looking at his wrists. 2:13 in the morning. "You didn't look back." "No," he said. "That was the hardest part," she said. "For me, not the rest of it." "That I know," he said. His voice had dropped. "I'm sorry." She released his hands and looked up at him, and whatever she'd been holding in her expression for the last 7 hours, the control, the managed clarity, the performance of someone who was thinking, rather than feeling relaxed by a degree that she noticed and didn't move to fix. "We'll talk about it," she said. "Later. Right now, we need to find Voss before he understands what losing the network actually means and decides to do something about it." Roman nodded. He started to say something, and then stopped, and she saw him revise whatever he'd been going to say into something shorter and more direct. "The second location," he said. "I don't know the address, but I heard them mention it. A name, Calvert House. Does that?" "Calvert House," Decker said from across the room. He was already on his phone. "It's a private residential property in the North Quarter. 12-room estate. Belongs to a holding company." He was quiet for 3 seconds while he listened to whoever was on the other end. "The holding company is registered to one of the 47 accounts." "One of my father's accounts," Vivienne said. "One of your accounts," Decker said, looking at her. "As of this morning." Vivienne thought about this. Thought about a man who had built half of a system and spent 20 years believing he would eventually own it, retreating now to a property that was funded by the system that had just collapsed around him. She thought about what that retreat meant, whether it was planning or panic or something in between. She thought about the fact that Voss was at a location he believed was invisible to her. She thought about the fact that it wasn't. "How long to get there?" she asked Decker. 12 minutes, he said. "Then we have 12 minutes before he figures out we know," she said. She looked at Roman. "Can you move?" "I've been sitting in a chair for 18 hours, Roman said. "Moving sounds excellent." She almost said something, then. Something that would have acknowledged more of the night, the weight of it, the specific texture of standing in a freight warehouse, holding a man's damaged wrists, and feeling the shift in the shape of everything. She didn't say it, in the place where she was keeping the things that needed time and distance to be properly said. "Then let's go," she said. The convoy to the North Quarter was 3 cars and took 11 minutes, and the radio silence in the car was the kind that happens when everyone in a contained space is thinking very hard about the same problem from different angles and hasn't yet found the angle that resolves it. Roman was in the back seat beside her, his hands in his lap, his head against the headrest, his eyes open and doing the specific thing they did when he was building a plan, a stillness that was actually the opposite of stillness. Focused internal movement that had no external expression except in the very slight tension around his jaw. "Voss doesn't know the sequence completed," Vivienne said. She was thinking out loud. She didn't particularly care if Roman was listening or not. The thinking needed to happen externally. He knows he lost terminal access. He knows something went wrong. But the sequence takes 7 minutes to complete, and we left the bank at 6 minutes, 12 seconds. He'll know it's gone by now. He'll have monitoring of his own on the network, but he won't know exactly when it completed. He'll think he has more time than he does. Roman said without opening his eyes. He'll be trying to find an alternative access point, she said. Something your father built that Voss knows about, and we don't. Roman was quiet for a moment. Then the ledger. She looked at him. What about it? The last section, he said. The instructions for the vault access and the kill sequence. Was there anything else? After the code? She thought about the last page. Her father's handwriting, the compressed script of something written urgently. The instructions, the sequence, the location, and at the bottom. He wrote to me, she said. A personal note, not instructions. Just, she stopped. Wait. She pulled the ledger from Decker's jacket pocket. Decker had retrieved it from Cass at some point in the reorganization she'd half attended, and opened it to the last page and looked at her father's words at the bottom. If you're reading this, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person. I'm sorry for all of it. The thing I built was supposed to protect you. I'm afraid that instead it put you in danger. Do what you think is right. You always have. I trusted your instincts before you trusted them yourself. She read it again, and then she read the sentence. Before the personal note, not the final sentiment, but the slat line of the actual instructions, the line she had read as closing punctuation rather than content. The secondary key has been voided. Only one door remains open, and only from the inside. She'd read it as metaphor, as her father being poetic about the network's architecture. It wasn't metaphor. Roman, she said. Her voice was different. She felt Roman go alert beside her at the change in it. The secondary key. Voss designed the biometric system. He built in a back door, Decker told me. A secondary key that he could insert during the rekeying window. Yes, Roman said. We knew about. My father voided it, Vivienne said. At some point before he died, he found it and voided it. He didn't tell Voss. He just closed the door. She looked at the page. Only one door remains open, and only from the inside. Kill architecture sequence. That was the only way in or out. That was what Voss has been waiting 20 years to use a back door that my father quietly removed. Carr was quiet. Voss doesn't know, Roman said slowly. Voss has been waiting 20 years for a back door that hasn't existed for at least 20 years, Vivienne said. He had my father killed to prevent the shutdown. But my father had already made the shutdown inevitable. He'd already removed the one piece that would have allowed Voss to take control during the rekeying window. She looked at Roman. When I initiated the kill sequence this morning, Voss tried to insert his secondary key through the biometric window, and it didn't work, and he didn't know why, and the network collapsed anyway. Roman stared at her. Your father outplayed him, Roman said, 20 years ago. And tonight, Vivienne said, when Voss realizes that the back door was never going to work, that he was never going to get what he wanted, no matter how long he waited, no matter what he did, he's going to want to make someone pay for that. She looked out the window. The North Quarter was beginning the street, the buildings older, the kind of neighborhood where money had been for several generations, and had acquired the patience of things that have always been present. We need to be at Calvert House before he finishes realizing it, she said. Carr accelerated. And then Decker's phone rang from the front seat, and he answered it. And what she saw happen to his face in the rearview mirror was the specific expression of someone receiving information that changes the geometry of an already bad situation into something geometrically worse. He lowered the phone. Calvert House, he said. Our advance contact just reported in. He paused. There are 12 armed men outside the perimeter that weren't there 20 minutes ago. Vivienne felt Roman go entirely still beside her. Moretti, Roman said. Full deployment, Decker said. Not a message. Not leverage. This is Voss calling in everything he has left, Vivienne said. She looked at Roman, and Roman looked at her, and between them was the understanding that they had 12 men with Decker, and 12 armed men were waiting at the location. They were 3 minutes from, and the reinforcements were still 8 minutes out, and none of those numbers resolved into anything comfortable. We stop and we wait for backup, Decker said, his voice carrying the tone of a recommendation he didn't expect to be followed. We stop and Voss has 8 more minutes to decide what to do with 12 armed men, and the knowledge that everything he's built his life around just disappeared, Vivienne said. What do you think he does with 8 minutes like that? Nobody answered, because Roman reached over, without looking at her, and took her hand. Not gently, he took it the way you take something you're not sure you'll be able to hold on to, firmly enough that the pressure said something his voice wasn't saying. She looked at their joined hands for 1 second, his bruised wrists, her cold fingers. Then she looked at Decker. "We don't stop," she said. Decker looked at her in the rearview mirror for a moment. Then he turned to the front and spoke to the driver, and the driver spoke into the radio. And in the car, the particular tension of a decision that has been made and cannot be revised settled over everyone like weather. The gates of Calvert House appeared at the end of the road. And as the car slowed at the perimeter, Vivienne's door opened, not from outside, but because she opened it herself, stepping out while the vehicle was still moving, onto the gravel of the entrance road, into the cold morning air, with the estate spread before her, and 12 armed men repositioning at her appearance, and the silence of a confrontation that had not yet broken into its inevitable conclusion. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the only thing she had that none of those 12 men, or the man directing them from somewhere inside that house, could counter. Father's signet ring. The one that Cass had given her from the storage unit's filing cabinet. She'd found it in the last box, in an envelope with her name on the front in her father's handwriting. She'd put it on her right hand in the car and hadn't to anyone mentioned it hand because it hadn't been time, and because she'd needed to think about what it meant and what it could do. She held up her right hand so the men at the perimeter could see it. One of them stopped moving, then another. She didn't fully understand what the ring meant to these men, what history it carried, what authority it represented in the hierarchy of the world her father had built, but she saw it work in real time, saw it travel through the assembled men like information, like a name spoken in the right room. Her father's name, her father's ring on his daughter's hand. Vivienne walked forward toward the gates of Calvert House, and the men parted, and in her ear she heard Decker say something she didn't catch, and behind her she heard Roman's footsteps on the gravel catching up with hers, and ahead of her the house waited, with its windows lit in the October morning, and Gideon Voss somewhere inside it, standing at the edge of the understanding that was going to destroy him, and the next 60 seconds would determine. The gravel was wet under her shoes from overnight dew, and it made a sound with each step that was very clear in the cold morning air, precise, unhurried, the sound of someone who had decided on a direction and was committed to it. Vivienne walked toward the gates of Calvert House, with her right hand raised, and her father's ring catching the flat October light, and the men who had been deployed around the perimeter continued to part, not dramatically, not like something choreographed, but with the gradual, almost reluctant repositioning of people who had received a signal they recognized and were processing what it meant for the calculation they'd already made. She counted 8 of them visible from the gate, 4 more somewhere in the grounds, according to Decker's advance contact. 12 total, and not one of them was moving toward her. Roman reached her left side. She heard his breathing controlled, the way he controlled things, when the alternative was losing them entirely. And she felt rather than saw him taking in the geometry of the scene, the positions of the men, the angles of approach, the variables that he'd been reading in rooms like this for 20 years. "The ring," he said quietly. Just those 2 words. "My father's," she said. "Cass had it." Roman was quiet for a step. "Then they know what it means." "I'm figuring that out," she said. The gates were iron, tall, unlocked. They swung inward at her push, with the slight resistance of hardware that was maintained but not frequently used. The estate's main path led through formal grounds to the house itself, perhaps 60 meters of gravel, bordered by hedges that had been shaped into something precise and held that shape with the discipline of years of attention. Calvert House was 3 stories, Georgian in its bones, with the slightly austere quality of a building that had been purchased for function rather than beauty, and had never quite absorbed the intention to be beautiful. Lights in the ground floor windows, a figure visible in one of them movement, then stillness, then movement again. Voss, she thought, watching. Behind her she heard Decker deploying his people along the outer perimeter, quiet commands in sequence. And she did not turn around, because turning around was not the posture she needed for the next 60 seconds. She walked up the path to the front door of Calvert House and knocked. The sound of it surprised her, the physicality of knocking, the ordinary domesticity of standing at a door and announcing yourself. Everything about the night had been extraordinary and loud and constructed, and here she was at the end of it, doing the most ordinary thing in the world. No one came. She tried the handle. The door was unlocked, pushed it open, and went in. The entrance hall was large and cold and smelled of a house that had been used recently, but not lived in. No cooking, no accumulated warmth, the smell of surfaces rather than lives. Staircase to the upper floors. 2 doors off the hall, both closed. Third at the far end, half open, with light coming through it. She went to the half-open door. The room beyond it was a study of sorts, a desk, several chairs, shelving with nothing on it, a fireplace that had been recently used and was still warm, the last of the fire reduced to orange coals. Gideon Voss was standing at the window with his back to her, looking out at the grounds, at the men arranged along the perimeter, at whatever he could see of the situation that had assembled itself around his location in the last 20 minutes. He was older than she'd imagined from his voice. 70, perhaps, or near it, tall and lean in the way of men who had been athletic and had carried that discipline into age, with white hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades expecting rooms to arrange themselves around his presence. He didn't turn when she came in. "The signet ring," he said. His voice was the same as it had been on the phone, precise, unhurried, with the accent she still couldn't fully place. Eastern European, perhaps, or the product of an Eastern European origin, sanded down by decades in other places. Martin made 3 of those. One for himself. One for the institution, what you might call a ceremonial key, kept in the vault. And one that he said was for his daughter, to be given to her if she ever needed to present herself to people who would recognize it. He paused. "I always wondered if that 3rd ring existed. Martin talked about you constantly." Vivienne came further into the room and stopped near one of the chairs. She did not sit. "Turn around," she said. He turned. His face was what she'd expected from his voice, composed, deliberate, the face of someone who had been managing situations for a very long time and had developed, through practice, the particular stillness that either indicated genuine calm or was the performance of it. She couldn't tell which it was. She wasn't sure it mattered. He looked at her. He looked at the ring. Something crossed his face that she wasn't prepared for, not calculation, not the reassembly of a plan, but something softer and considerably more unsettling. Something that looked, briefly and unmistakably, like grief. "You look like him," Voss said, around the eyes. "Don't," Vivienne said. The word came out harder than she intended, but she didn't revise it. Voss looked at her for a moment, then nodded slightly, as though acknowledging a fair boundary. "The network," he said. "It's gone." "Yes." "Completely, the kill sequence completed?" "Yes." He absorbed this. He turned back to the window, then seemed to think better of it and turned back to face her. "How much did Decker tell you about the back door?" "Enough," she said. "He told me you designed it into the biometric system, that you'd been waiting 20 years for the rekeying event to use it." "And did he tell you," Voss said carefully, "that I never intended to use it against you?" Vivienne looked at him. "I intended," Voss said, "to use it to give you full access. The biometric rekeying would have transferred control to you. My secondary key was designed to run alongside your primary authentication, not to supersede it, as Decker apparently believes, but to validate it. Confirm the transfer to the people inside the network's structure who wouldn't recognize your biometric alone because they'd never met you." He paused. "I designed a corroboration mechanism, not a takeover." The room was very quiet. "That's a convenient reframing," Vivienne said, "of a system whose design you haven't been able to explain to anyone for 20 years. "I haven't been able to explain it," Voss said, "because I haven't been in a position to explain it. I've been conducting this entire effort from outside every room where the relevant conversations were happening, which is itself a consequence of Martin dying before we could." He stopped. Something in his expression tightened and then released. "Before he could tell people who I was and what my role was supposed to be." "Your role," Vivienne said. "Executor," Voss said. That was the word Martin used. "Not in the legal sense, in the practical sense. Person who makes sure that what was built is properly handed over to the person it was built for." He looked at her steadily. "He built it for you, not as an empire to inherit, as a tool of exit, A way to generate enough financial independence through legitimate means that you would never need to depend on anyone. Would never be in a position where someone else controlled your options. Vivienne heard this. She heard it, and she held it. And she thought about the letter I built a cage. I told myself it was a house, and she thought about how two things could be true simultaneously, that her father had built something with good intentions, and that those intentions had been, in practice, indistinguishable from the thing he was trying to protect her from. He had you killed, she said. Whatever you built together, whatever you intended, you had my father killed. The word you landed in the room and stayed there. Voss went very still. No, he said. The single syllable had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not certainty, something rawer than certainty. Decker. Decker is wrong, Voss said. Or Decker is lying. Those are the two options. His voice had changed completely. Composed, deliberate quality was gone. In its place was something that she recognized, to her surprise. As the same thing, she was carrying the specific register of someone speaking about a loss they had not recovered from. Martin was my friend. He was my colleague, and my friend for 22 years. I did not have him killed. I have spent 20 years trying to find out who did. Vivienne stared at him. Decker, she said slowly. Show me what evidence he gave you, Voss said, for his version of events. Show me the specific documents, the photographs, the testimony. Show me what he used to build his case. She thought about the manila envelope, photographs, the documents, the letter, her father's letter, the one in his handwriting. She thought about the fact that her father's handwriting was something Decker had had access to for 20 years, that the letter had come from Decker's envelope, that Zuher handed to her in her living room at 3 in the morning when she was exhausted and overwhelmed, and receiving information in the sequence Decker had chosen. She thought about Cass, saying, I don't know if Decker is clean in the storage unit, and then Decker appearing 20 minutes later with full knowledge of where the storage unit was. She thought about Decker saying Roman suspected him about Voss, but Roman had been in Moretti's custody since 2 nights ago. Roman hadn't told Decker anything recently. So where had Decker's specific knowledge of Roman's suspicions come from? The test, she said aloud. She was thinking as she spoke, and she didn't stop herself. Roman was testing his people. He gave different information to different people to see which information appeared where it shouldn't. The meeting where Roman was taken, Roman gave that location to Decker. She looked at Voss. Roman was taken from a meeting whose location only Decker knew. Yes, Voss said. But Decker told me tonight that the evidence pointed to you, she said. The meeting location being compromised meant you were the leak. Because Decker is the leak, Voss said. And the best way to remain the leak is to ensure that the investigation into the leak ends at someone else's door. The fire in the grate made a small sound, a coal settling, a shift in what remained of it. The room was warm from it and cold from the window, and Vivienne stood between the two temperatures and thought about the shape of the night from the beginning. Decker appearing the moment Roman left. Decker providing documents. Decker managing her movements, managing her information, managing the pace and sequence of every revelation, managing her toward the vault, toward the kill sequence. He wanted the network destroyed, she said. He's worked for the faction that wanted it destroyed. For 6 years, Voss said. Not Moretti, the other faction. The one that originally had your father killed. The one that decided 20 years ago that the network had become too autonomous and needed to be eliminated. Decker was placed inside Roman's organization specifically to find a way to trigger the kill architecture. He needed the person with biometric access to initiate it. He looked at her. He needed you. And he spent tonight, Vivienne said, giving me every reason to do exactly that. The door to the study opened. Roman came in, and 2 steps behind him, Decker, and behind Decker, one of Decker's men with a weapon that was no longer pointed at a threat, but at Roman's back, and Decker's expression was the one she should have been reading all night. The one that had been present under the composed, regretful helpfulness, the expression of someone who had arrived at the end of a very long project. Vivienne, Decker said. His voice was exactly as it had always been. That was the most frightening thing about it. Step away from Voss. Roman's eyes found hers. He didn't speak. He communicated in the way of someone whose hands were effectively occupied through the angle of his head, the specific quality of his stillness. And what he communicated was, I know. I just found out. I'm sorry I couldn't warn you. She looked at Decker. The faction that killed my father, she said. You've been with them since the beginning. Since 6 years ago, Decker said. When I understood what the network had become and what it needed to become instead, which was nothing. He said it without heat, without the quality of someone who felt the need to defend his position. He said it like someone stating a preference for how a room should be arranged. Your father built something that had grown past any individual's ability to control responsibly. The only responsible outcome was always its elimination. I've been working toward that outcome. He looked at the terminal. There was no terminal here, but the gesture was in his gaze, the reference to what had happened that morning. Thanks to you, it's done. It's done, Vivienne agreed. Then there's no further complication, Decker said. Voss has no network. You have no network. The architecture is gone. The accounts are inaccessible. Everyone who's been fighting over this for 20 years has been fighting over something that no longer exists. He tilted his head slightly. That should be a relief. Should be, Vivienne said. Voss will face consequences for what he's done, Decker said. Roman will need time to rebuild, or not rebuild. That's his choice. And you, he paused, and something moved behind his eyes that she read, finally and correctly, as genuine. You were never supposed to be in this. Your father never wanted you in this. Everything I've done tonight has been in service of getting you out of it. By manipulating me into destroying my father's life's work, Vivienne said. By completing what your father started, Decker said. He wanted to shut it down. He wrote as much. He'd already voided Voss's secondary key. He'd already made the decision. He died before he could complete it. I completed it. And my father's death, Vivienne said. That was also completion? Decker's expression didn't change. That decision wasn't mine. But you knew who made it. A pause. Fractional. Yes. For 6 years, she said. You knew who killed my father, and you spent 6 years inside the organization of the man who was trying to find out. She let that sit. Did you know before Roman brought you in? Or did Roman bringing you in give you the access to keep it buried? Decker looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted not remorse, but the recognition of being seen clearly, which was its own kind of admission. Both, he said. And then, because apparently honesty had become the mode, now that everything else had run its course, I respected your father. I want you to know that. What I did with the faction decided was not personal. It was structural. Martin had built something that was going to destabilize every legitimate institution in this city if it continued operating. The decision to stop it was not made lightly. You killed him, Vivienne said. And then you spent 20 years making sure no one found out. And tonight you used me to finish what you started. She looked at him steadily. And you want me to understand it as structural. Decker held her gaze. I want you to understand it accurately. I understand it accurately, she said. That's what I'm telling you. The man behind Roman still had his weapon up, and Decker still had the room, and Vivienne was standing near the fireplace with the warmth of the dying coals against the back of her legs. And the situation had the particular geometry of an ending that hadn't yet decided which kind of ending it was going to be. Then Voss said, from the window, the men outside. Everyone looked at him. The 12 men outside this house, Voss said, with the precision of someone who has been waiting for the exact right moment to contribute a piece of information. They're not Moretti's. They were never Moretti's. He looked at Decker. They're mine. They've been mine for 3 weeks. I positioned them around this property when I came to the city because I knew I've known for 2 years that Decker was the leak, and I knew that wherever the endgame happened, Decker would try to control it. He paused. Been outside this house for approximately 20 minutes. They came in through the perimeter when Decker's people were repositioned to escort Vivienne up the path. Decker's expression did something complex and rapid. They're in the house, Voss said simply. Right now. They've been in the house for 7 minutes. I've been waiting for this specific conversation to reach this specific point before telling you that. Decker turned toward the door. The door opened from outside before he reached it, and the man who came through it was not one of Decker's people and was carrying the particular physical authority of someone who had been waiting in a cold hallway for for 7 minutes and was entirely prepared for what came next. What followed was not clean. None of it was clean. The man behind Roman moved, and Roman moved faster. The difference between a man who was operational and a man who had been sitting in a metal chair for 18 hours and was furious about it. And the weapon changed hands with a violence that made a sound Vivienne would remember for a long time. Decker reached the door and did not make it through the door. Two of Voss's people and one of Decker's people resolved their respective situations in the hallway with a speed and efficiency that she witnessed from the study doorway and did not look away from, because looking away felt like a dishonesty she couldn't afford anymore. Decker, in the end, was not violent. That was the thing that surprised her most. When the room had finished reorganizing itself, when the numbers had resolved in the direction they resolved, Decker stood against the study wall, with Roman beside him, and Voss's people in the room, and the particular expression of someone who had run out of moves and knew it, and was now doing the thing that came after not. Surrender, exactly, but the settling into an outcome. He looked at Vivienne. "What happens now," he said, "is your decision." "Yes," she said, "it is." What happened in the following 2 hours was not dramatic. Drama had exhausted itself somewhere between the vault and the gravel path and the study with its dying fire, and what replaced it was the grinding, detailed, profoundly undramatic work of an ending that had to be administered rather than experienced. Decker and 2 of his people were secured. Voss made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, in 2 languages, to people whose roles Vivienne gathered were legal, institutional, and specifically positioned to receive the kind of information that Decker and his faction had spent 20 years suppressing. The calls were brief and precise, and she understood enough of them to understand that what was being set in motion was a process rather than a conclusion, something that would take months and possibly years to fully unfold through the structures that handled these things. Roman sat on the edge of the desk and watched and didn't speak for a long time. His wrists had been wrapped by one of Voss's people, who turned out to have medical training. Cut on his forehead had been cleaned. He looked like someone at the edge of a very long exhaustion. Not the dramatic exhaustion of acute crisis, but the specific bone-deep tiredness of someone who has been running on tension for months and has just had the tension removed, and can feel, for the first time, what was underneath it. She sat beside him on the desk at some point during the second hour, and they watched the room work through its processes without contributing to them, and the silence between them had a different quality than any silence that had existed in the night so far. It was not comfortable, exactly, but it was honest. "The faction," she said eventually, "the one Decker was working for. Do you know who runs it?" "I have a name," Romans said. "I've had it for 6 months. It's why I was building the case. I needed everything documented before I moved against someone at that level." He looked at the floor. "Decker was my path to that documentation. I thought I was using him. He was using me more effectively." "Not in the end," Vivienne said. "Not in the end," he agreed. She looked at her hands. Her right hand, with her father's signet ring on it. She turned the ring on her finger, feeling the weight of it, the specific solidity of an object that had belonged to someone who was gone and had traveled a long path to arrive at her hand on this particular morning. "You were going to tell me," she said, "about Voss, about the faction, about all of it. You had a plan for when you were going to tell me. When I had proof," Roman said. "When I had everything I needed to give you the complete picture instead of the complicated version of my father," she said. He was quiet. "Roman," she said. She kept her voice even, which required something from her that she noted and accepted as a cost. "I understand why you made the decisions you made. I understand the logic of them. I need you to understand that the logic doesn't make them right." "I know," he said. "My father made the same decisions," she said. "He built something to protect me without asking me if I wanted to be protected that way. You married me knowing what I'd inherited without telling me I'd inherited it. You spent 15 years keeping me safe from something you'd decided I couldn't handle." She turned the ring on her finger again. I'm not saying what I feel about that right now. I'm not sure I have language for what I feel about that right now. But I'm saying it happened, and we're going to have to talk about it. Eventually." "Yes," Roman said, "we are." "Not tonight," she said. "No," he agreed, "not tonight." She looked at the ring. She looked at the room. She looked at Voss across the study. older than she'd imagined, standing at the window again, with his phone in his hand and the morning light on his face. And she thought about a man who had built half of a system with her father and spent 20 years trying to do right by the wreckage of their partnership and had been in the wrong room every time the important conversations happened. Voss, she said. He turned. My father voided your secondary key, she said. He didn't tell you. No, Voss said. You spent 20 years working toward something that had already been foreclosed, she said. He held her gaze. Yes. Did you know? She asked. At some point, did you suspect? Voss was quiet for a moment. Then, 3 years ago, when I finally reverse-engineered the authentication architecture from outside and found the gap where the secondary key should have been, he paused. He voided it the same week he started trying to shut down the network. He made both decisions at the same time. He was closing every door. He looked at the ring on her hand, except the one that led to you. Vivienne thought about that. She thought about her father making 2 decisions in the same week, closing the door he'd opened for his partner, opening a different door for his daughter, and then dying before he could explain either of them to anyone. He trusted you, she said. Before the end, he trusted you. The letter I found the one in the ledger. The personal note he wrote, he said, I'm sorry for all of it. The apology was in the ledger that was written to me, but the thing he was sorry for was bigger than just me. She looked at Voss. He was sorry he didn't tell you what he'd decided. Voss didn't answer that. He looked at the window. Outside, the October morning had fully established itself, the light flat and clean, and without warmth, the way October light was always without warmth but not without clarity. For what it's worth, Vivienne said, the network is gone. Everything you worked toward is gone. But what you actually wanted, what you said you wanted, which is the same thing my father said he wanted, was for me to be able to stand in a room and make my own decisions. She held up her right hand, the ring on it. I'm standing in the room. I made the decisions. A pause. I thought you should know that your version of the plan worked, even if the plan had to go through several other versions first. Voss looked at her hand. He looked at the ring. Something crossed his face that was, she thought, as close to resolution as a 70-year-old man who had spent 20 years carrying a complicated weight was going to get in a single moment. He nodded once. Not a bow, just an acknowledgement. Specific gesture of someone who has received something they have been waiting to receive for a long time. They left Calvert House at 10:30 in the morning, and the drive back through the city was nothing like the drive out to it. The urgency was gone. The specific tension of moving toward something had been replaced by the particular quality of moving away from something, which was a different kind of tiredness and required a different kind of silence, and held the pressure until the light changed. Roman slept for 20 minutes in the car, which she knew because his breathing changed in the way she'd learned over 11 years, and because the hand that was holding hers went slightly less tense. She didn't sleep. She watched the city reassemble itself through the window, the October streets. People who had spent the night sleeping and were now buying coffee and walking dogs and conducting the ordinary business of days that had not been what this one had been, and she thought about what came after. Not strategically, not with the planning orientation that had carried her through the night. She thought about it the way you think about the aftermath of a storm, with a kind of inventory that isn't about what to do next, but about what the storm has changed. Her father's network was gone. 47 accounts, 20 years of accumulated architecture, the infrastructure of a shadow economy that had been built to protect her and had become, over time, the thing that endangered her gone. Completely, in a 7-minute sequence, she had initiated in a sealed vault with a dying fluorescent light buzzing above her head. She felt something about this that she couldn't fully name. Not grief exactly, not relief exactly, something that occupied the space between them. The name that Roman had, the head of the faction that had killed her father, was in the documentation that Voss's legal contacts were now processing. It was a name that existed in legitimate structures, which was why it had taken so long and so much to reach it. And what happened to that name now was going to be determined by processes that were out of her direct control and would take longer than any single night. She had made her peace with that, or she was in the process of making her peace with it, which was the best available version of peace for something like this. Decker was in custody and would remain so while the relevant structures worked through what they had been given. The faction he'd worked for was exposed, not destroyed, because these things were never destroyed in a single motion, but illuminated, which was the necessary precondition for anything that came after. Roman was beside her in the car with his head against the headrest and his bruised wrists and his damaged face and 20 years of decisions that he'd made in her name without her knowledge, and she was going to have to decide what she did with that. Not today, but eventually, she was going to have to decide what she did with a lot of things. Penthouse was, as she'd left it, the cold mug of chamomile tea on the counter, the documents from Dare's envelope in piles on the floor of Roman's study, the photograph of her father still where she'd left it after she'd picked it up, and read the 2 words on the back, and put it down, and gone to find shoes she could move in. She put it back on the desk. She looked at it for a moment. She thought about her father at 20 years of distance, the man she'd known, and the man she apparently hadn't known, and the ways those 2 versions of him overlapped and didn't. She thought about what it meant to love someone whose complete picture you'd never had. She thought about the fact that incomplete pictures were, possibly, the only kind that existed. She left the study and went to the kitchen and poured out the cold tea and made new tea and stood at the window, while it steeped and looked at the street below. The SUVs were gone. The men were gone. The street was an ordinary street in an expensive neighborhood on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and there was no indication that it had been anything else 12 hours ago. Roman came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at her. "There are things I should have told you," he said. He'd been working toward saying it for a while. She could tell it had the quality of a sentence that had been revised multiple times in the mind of someone who wanted to get it right. "Yes," she said. "There are. I made decisions that weren't mine to make," he said. "About what you could handle. About what you needed to know. He stopped. About your life." "Yes," she said again. "I told myself it was protection," he said. "I think I believed that. I also think." He stopped again, and this time the stop was longer. The kind that comes when you reach the part of the truth that's harder to say, not because you don't know it, but because saying it out loud does something irreversible to the shape of it. "I think I was afraid that if you knew the full picture, you would make choices I didn't want you to make. And I dressed that fear up as protection, because protection sounds better than fear." Turned from the window. She looked at him across the kitchen, the counter between them. The morning light on the left side of his face, the damage from the last 24 hours still visible and not going to stop being visible for a while. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 11 years, she said. He held her gaze. "I know. It doesn't fix it," she said. "I know that too," he said. She picked up her tea. She drank it standing at the counter. It was the right temperature this time, which felt like a small concrete mercy after a night of everything being the wrong temperature. "My father wanted me to be able to stand in a room and make my own decisions," she said. That's what Voss said. That's what the letter said, in its way. The whole thing, the network, the protection, the ring, it was all supposed to lead to that. She looked at the mug. "I think the problem is that nobody asks me if that's what I wanted." Roman waited. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I'm not leaving. That's not what this is. But I'm also not going back to what we were before, because what we were before was built on a foundation that wasn't fully visible to me, and I need to rebuild on something I can see all the way down." She looked at him directly, which means no more decisions made in my name without my knowledge. No more information managed on the basis of what I can supposedly handle. No more protection that looks like love from inside and looks like control from outside. She set the mug down. "If you can agree to that, then we have somewhere to start. Can't, then I need to know that too." Roman crossed to the counter and stood on the other side of it and looked at her with the look he had, that she'd never been able to fully read. The one that was always more complex than any single emotion could account for. "I can agree to that," he said. "Mean it," she said. "I mean it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the photograph visible through the open study door. Her father at 20 years of distance. His borrowed dignity, his complicated love, his incomplete explanations. She looked at the window and the ordinary street below it and the city that was doing what cities did and would continue doing regardless of what any particular night had been. She looked at the ring on her right hand. She took it off. She held it in her palm and looked at it, at the weight of it, at what it represented and what it didn't represent, and what she was choosing to do with the things it represented. She put it in the inside pocket of her coat, where the ledger had been, not throwing it away, not displaying it, carrying it on her own terms. "I need to sleep," she said. "So do I," Roman said. "Then we'll sleep," she said. "And when we wake up, we'll start figuring out what comes next." Together, she picked up the mug and walked past him toward the hallway. "And you'll ask me before you decide anything that involves my life." "Yes," he said. "Say it like a question," she said without turning around. "Beat." And then, from behind her, the voice, in the voice of a man who was relearning something he should have known from the beginning. "Can I be part of figuring out what comes next? With you?" She stopped in the hallway. She thought about her answer. She thought about the night, and the vault, and the gravel path, and the ring, and her father's handwriting, and the 2 words on the back of a photograph, and everything that had led from 2:13 in the morning to right now, this moment, this hallway. "Yes," she said. She went to bed. Months later, the penthouse was quieter. Not empty. Roman was there, and she was there, and the negotiation of what that meant had been ongoing and difficult, and had required the kind of honesty that left you feeling exposed in ways that took time to get used to, but quieter. The weight of the undisclosed had lifted, and what replaced it was lighter and more uncertain, and somehow easier to breathe around. Roman turned over the organization's legitimate businesses to a management structure that didn't require his ongoing involvement, and the rest of it, the parts that weren't legitimate, he dismantled from within, with the particular efficiency of someone who understood the internal architecture. It took 3 months, and was not without danger, and was not something he described to her in detail, but he described to her in outline, which was what she'd asked for, and the outline was enough. The faction that had killed her father was, by December, being examined by the kind of institution that examined such things, and the name that Roman had was part of the documentation that Voss's legal contacts had been working through, and the outcome of that examination was going to take longer than either of them would have liked. But it was moving, which was what moved was. Voss left the city in November. He sent a letter, an actual letter, handwritten, in the precise, deliberate script of someone for whom handwriting was still a considered act, addressed to Vivienne, and not to Roman. It said very little that required saying, and a few things that did. He expressed what she read as genuine unperformed regret for the consequences of choices made by people who had believed they were making them correctly. He said that he hoped she had found what the network was always supposed to create, which was freedom from the necessity of the network. He closed with her father's name, just the name, and nothing after it. She read it twice and filed it in the drawer with her father's birthday card. Her father's lawful enterprises, the legitimate structures that had been operating independently for 20 years, the parts that didn't require the network to function were still operating. Vivienne had spent November understanding them, not taking them over in any dramatic sense, but learning their shape, their personnel, their function. They were smaller than she'd imagined and more solid. Her father had built them with the same meticulousness he'd built everything else, and they had the quality of things designed to outlast their architect. She made one change. In December, she had the company's legal documentation amended to reflect the actual name of its beneficial owner. Her name, not as Roman's wife, not as Martin Calder's daughter, as herself with her own signature on her own terms. The day she signed the documents, she drove back to the penthouse, through the December streets, and sat in the car for a few minutes in the underground parking structure before going upstairs. She sat with the engine off and the quiet of the concrete structure around her, and thought about a year that had begun with one life and ended with another, and she thought about the cost of that change, and the parts of it that were still being paid and would continue to be paid in the smaller denominations of ordinary days, the conversations, the adjustments, the ongoing work of a marriage being rebuilt on a foundation both people could see all the way down. Thought about her father. She thought about what he had wanted for her, and what he had done in the name of that wanting, and the ways those two things had been different from each other, and the ways they had not. She took the ring out of her coat pocket, where she still carried it. She looked at it. She put it on. Not because it changed anything. Not because it resolved the complications of what her father had been and what he'd built and what that building had cost. Put it on because she had decided to carry it visibly, which was different from carrying it hidden, and she was capable of making that distinction now, in a way she hadn't been capable of at the beginning of the year, and the capacity felt like something worth acknowledging. She went upstairs. Roman was in the kitchen, which was where he spent the late afternoons since the reorganization of his schedule had cleared them. He was reading something on a tablet and had made coffee, and the kitchen smelled of it, and the late December light was coming through the window at the angle it came at this time of year, low and direct, the way winter light was in this city. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her hand, the ring, visible now on her right hand. He didn't say anything. Something in his face, in the set of it, in the specific quality of stillness, that was actually the opposite of stillness, said what the absence of words was containing. "Don't make it a thing," she said. "I'm not making it a thing," he said. "Your face is making it a thing," she said. "My face," he said, "is just my face." Poured herself coffee and stood at the counter, and they were quiet for a minute, and the quiet was the good kind. The kind that meant what it appeared to mean and wasn't covering anything. "It was a hard year," Roman said eventually. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He stopped. He revised. "How are you?" Not, "Are you okay?" That specific revision, catching himself before the question that assumed an answer, replacing it with the more open one that left room for whatever the actual answer was. She noticed it. She didn't remark on it because remarking on every small evidence of change would be exhausting and would make him self-conscious and would miss the point, which was that the change was its own acknowledgement. "I'm getting there," she said. "You?" "Getting there," he said. She drank her coffee. Outside the window, 42 floors below, the city was doing its December thing, people, moving quickly in the cold, lights coming on in windows as the afternoon dimmed, the ordinary complexity of a place where many lives were being lived simultaneously in different states of resolution. 20 black SUVs were not in the street. They would not be in the street again. That particular chapter had closed the way. The chapters close not with fanfare, not with a clean line, but with the gradual, undramatic withdrawal of what had been present until it simply was not. And the street looked like what it was. A street, ordinary, theirs. Vivienne finished her coffee and set the mug down and looked at the window and felt, for the first time in a year, that had not had many such moments, something that was approximately like quiet, not peace, exactly. She was too honest with herself to call it peace when there were still things unresolved and processes still running and the ongoing work of a rebuilt life still underway. But quiet, the specific, hard-won quiet of someone who has come through a version of themselves they didn't know they were capable of being, and has arrived, imperfect and clear-eyed and still standing, on the other side, turned from the window. Roman was watching her, the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, the particular attention of someone who had spent a long time seeing only part of a person, and was now working to see all of it. "Ask me something," she said. He looked at her. "What do you want for dinner?" She almost smiled. She caught it, but only just. "That's what you're going with." "It's a real question," he said. "I'm asking it, as agreed." "As agreed," she said. She thought about it for a moment. She looked at the city out the window. She looked at the ring on her hand. She thought about a year of decisions, made and unmade, and the things that had come through all of them still intact, and the things that hadn't, and the difference between the two. "Something simple," she said. "Let's make something simple." And that was what they did.